You're listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place. Hello, and welcome back after quite the hiatus to Arcane Carolinas.
Hello, Charlie.
Hello, Michael. That's the way I usually say it. I'm your co-host, Charlie Mushaw.
I'm your other co-host, multi-award winning novelist, Michael G. Williams. I'm self-conscious about saying it again because I've said it in front of people at too many live events. But anyway.
But we're here. And I think that it is important to acknowledge the hiatus and then explain that it wasn't a hiatus at all.
Yeah. Oh, my Lord.
If you follow us on social media, you might know some of this. Sorry. The first volume of Arcane Carolinas, the book, nonfiction, is done and is currently being edited for a release this fall. So there's been a lot of work on that.
Yeah. And we've done about 1 million conventions and other live stuff.
And we've been stockpiling those recordings for the fall. So we've gotten a few comments here and there. I've been like, make with the spooky. Where's my cryptids? We've been saving them for you.
I mean, one of my favorite things about the live recordings is that it kind of gives people the experience of having been there. So even if they couldn't be there, they can kind of be there. And I think that's really fun.
Yeah, and you've been pretty hard at work on editing those so that it's still the live experience, but the audio quality is ratcheted up as much as we can.
Yeah, who knew that a hotel conference room or the sort of ballroom that they put people in for panels at conventions, things like that, who knew they were not recording studios and the sound quality would be kind of awful, but with significant editing can be made much better.
So we've been working on getting the episodes ready for the fall. We've been working on putting the finishing touches on the book. TV. We recorded a series of segments for Beaufort County, South Carolina's upcoming series, Sea Island Stories. That is so many S's.
I think it's Sea Island Spirits.
Sea Island Spirits. There you go. There's the correction. I'm sorry, but I just said so many S's. I caught myself saying, saying S's, Sea Island Spirit. I apologize. The actual title of the program is amazing.
Oh, yeah. It's fantastic.
I just happened to slam half a dozen S's on the front and the back. So I sounded like the Python in the old Disney Robin Hood. Yes, sire.
Indeed. No, but that's going to be so much fun. We got to record at Arcane in Durham, where they let us come in and record in their space. Got to have the coolest setting and just have fun talking to each other about stories from Beaufort County, South Carolina. The folks from Beaufort County have been so nice. It's going to be so much fun to watch those come out.
And those will be available. You don't have to live in Beaufort County to watch them on your television. You can also watch them on your computer. They'll be online. We'll post links. I checked out the website. Apparently, you'll be able to purchase DVDs. So if you hate computers and want to buy a DVD of it, you can do that too. So many, many ways to watch that series once it comes out this fall. So we know that we haven't been posting episodes. That's why. There are so many things that I want to talk about right now, mostly around aliens and UFOs, but that is not what we are here to do today.
Although today's story is set in a place that we covered when we were at Con Carolinas. Each of us had different stories from this place. So it's going to be interesting. Robeson County, North Carolina is going to get a lot of love this fall.
I feel like it already has.
It's a fascinating place. I've never been there, but I feel like they've got a lot going on, both in terms of history and in terms of weird stuff.
I feel like it just keeps popping up in stories. And I'm like, oh, all right. Maybe someone should check the ley lines or, whatever other way that we can correlate why it's so weird.
Yeah. And I want to start this episode, which, by the way, is going to be about a figure known colloquially. Let's see if I can manage to get consonants out.
I struggle with this word every time. It warms my heart to have heard you say that.
Well, now it's all going to get left in. So this figure from history is known colloquially as the Robin Hood of the swamp.
Coca-Cola.
Yes, Coca-Cola. That's probably what I said for like 25 years of my life.
I just made a Robin Hood animated rep. Okay, great. Look, it's all coming together. That wasn't planned.
First up, I want to start with a shout out to a listener, a friend of the show, who has messaged with us before about something called the Lost Colony DNA Project. And that person goes online by the moniker That Modern Mombi.
Oh, yeah. We met her at Con Carolina.
Yeah. Mombi as in a zombie who is a mom. User That Modern Mombi. Talk to us about it via email and then talk to us again at Con Carolinas. And we are definitely going to talk about the DNA project at some point in the future, because the stuff that she sent us and like her family's direct experience with it is just so fascinating. It is such a cool idea.
Can we talk about Con Carolinas for a split second?
Yeah.
And how I gave the lowest energy presentation ever on that Sunday.
So in the spooky season, when that one comes out, it's going to be combined with my episode
dropped,
because my episode was pretty high energy.
Yeah.
And your episode was pretty low energy.
I think it should probably just be dropped. And it should be if you were there, you saw it, and I'm sorry.
Okay, maybe that's what'll happen. And I'm going to leave all this in too, so that people who were not there will A, be incentivized to come see us at some point, and also B, so that they can just
it was horrible. It was the worst one Charlie's ever done. Listen, they can't all be bangers.
Look, I'll take hate listens. I don't care.
So bad.
I started to say the money all spends anyway, but we don't get paid to do this. But
no, this is a net loss.
Right. The money all costs anyway.
I mean, but we don't run ads. That's the whole thing. We're not here like, what else costs, Michael? Special underpants. You can get them today exclusively with download at Arcane Carolinas.
Go to underpants.com/
right. Use coupon code Charlie's Low Energy Con Carolina session. It'll be a very long coupon code. Anyway, sorry. Con Carolinas, if you were there, I hope you had fun Saturday. I did, and paid for it Sunday.
I just really want to know what the tie-in would be between underpants and low energy. Oh, well, anyway, I'm sure that there's a product out there that would answer that question. Caffeinated underpants. So anyway.
Get your button gear.
Oh my God. I hope somebody uses that.
Turbo pants.
Turbo pants.
Got my turbo pants on. So Robin Hood of the Swamp.
Yeah, somebody just give me a second to jot that down for a future science fiction novel. I'll write it under a pen name. So, the Robin Hood of the Swamp, who was a guy who existed in history, and his name was Henry Berry Lowry. But first, the origins of the Lumbee in their own words, because it's really important that we start there.
Buckle up. It's Michael's hidden history. Hope you brought snacks.
I'm not saying how many pages of notes I have. So it's a lot. First, I want to start by pointing folks to the website lumbeetribe.com. That's LUMBEE tribe.com. They have a fantastic set of resources explaining the origins of Lumbee people, including that there is archaeological evidence for human habitation along the Lumber River as far back as 12,000 BCE. And that this area is prominent in the traditional histories of many different peoples from this region as a cultural crossroads long before the Lumbee emerged as a people. This was a place where people could live, they could trade, they could travel. This was a common cultural crossroads for many indigenous nations.
It was like it was the south of the border of olden times.
I think they probably were a little more responsible. I don't know. It's just so fitting because south of the border is right there.
See what I did there?
Or was right there? I can't really tell what the status of south of the border is these days. The Lumbee describe on that website many different reasons why their ancestors relocated to this area from multiple other regions and from among multiple other peoples, including, as they point out, oppression and endangerment at the hands of colonizers and colonial powers. Native American people were enslaved, they were exposed to diseases, they were driven from their traditional lands, and they had their traditional cultures actively, consciously destroyed. And that forced them together to sort of, as we talked in other episodes, start synthesizing and syncretizing a new culture and a new people out of multiple origins. When I was reading their materials, one of the most powerful phrases that they used was that their ancestors, quote, sought shelter from a world that had made it perilous to be Indian. That phrase really struck with me, and that idea also really bears out in the story that we're about to discuss, and that is, in fact, the heart of the Henry Berry Lowry story. So the ancestors of the Lumbee people were from cultures associated with three specific language families, Eastern Siouan, Algonquin, and Iroquoian, which basically covers the map for the Carolinas, at least for the eastern parts of the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm.
They were formed from a broad, multi-generational set of cultural shifts and migrations that reflected this generations of encroachment and erasure rather than individuals trying to go somewhere else on their own. And these migrations were of whole communities and cultures. And I say all of that because later we're going to discuss some of the ways that white people wrote about them and tried to construct their own explanations for the existence of the Lumbee as part of their mistreatment of the Lumbee. And so I want to show full respect for the Lumbee people by starting with their history and their experience as they have experienced it and written it and shared it. As they say, they had been living and thriving along the Lumber River or the Lumbee River. It gets referred to in both ways at different points in time by different people for a very long time when they were, quote unquote, discovered. And throughout this episode, I'm going to refer to them as the Lumbee because that's their chosen name for themselves, regardless of how people at one time or another might have referred to them in other ways, because I want to use their word for themselves. But we're going to talk some about how they got described by other people at various points. Henry Berry Lowry. He was born roughly around 1845. He was the son of Allen and Mary Lowry, and Allen Lowry owned a 350-acre farm. When I describe him as a farmer, I'm not talking about a dude who had like a little plot in his front yard. I'm talking about 350 acres of farmland. Mm-hmm. The Lowrys were what were called at the time free people of color, and that was a legal category that had been created in 1835 and applied to people who were not white and were not enslaved. And sometimes that's described as mostly having been people of mixed ethnic heritage, but really it was applied to anybody who was just those two things, not white and free, and that included indigenous peoples. An important note about, quote, free people of color is that they were not allowed to own weapons of any kind and had to ask permission from white authorities in order to own, for instance, like a hunting rifle or a musket or a pistol or anything. Throughout the Civil War, but especially during its second half, as the Confederacy's defeat became increasingly obvious, Native Americans in the eastern part of the Carolinas were often taken under arms by authorities and used as forced labor in construction of Confederate fortifications. And this was called conscription, but it heavily targeted Native people in and around Robeson County and southeastern North Carolina. The Confederacy had been trying to defend Wilmington and specifically its port by building enormous earthworks around Fort Fisher in order to absorb artillery fire from the U.S. Navy blockade. And building these earthworks was enormously labor intensive. At first, the Confederate military had tried to hire people, but they ran out of people that they could hire, and then they ran out of free labor in the form of enslaved people, in part due to people leaving, in part due to people being forced into military service, in part due to disease. The region was rife with yellow fever for many years, and especially so during the squalor of wartime construction conditions. And so the Confederacy started seizing enslaved people from plantations and farms throughout the Carolinas. But those plantation owners started getting increasingly angry because their so-called business model couldn't be sustained without enslaved people doing their labor. So their crops started failing, and the enslaved people that they had planned to have work in their fields were being treated even worse by the Confederate military than they were by plantation owners. Like, legit, for real, in the historical record, one of the concerns at the time on the part of plantation owners was they thought that their enslaved people were being mistreated by the military. As the war ground on, the Confederacy started kidnapping free people of color and forcing them to build the earthworks. Mm-hmm. Literally, the home guard of the Confederacy would ride or march into a Native American dominant town or onto a farm owned by Native Americans, quote unquote, conscript every boy or man who was able to do physical labor. They would bind their hands, load them onto trains, take them to Fort Fisher, and there they would say, you have to work construction unpaid until we tell you otherwise. And so the Confederate Home Guard appointed conscription officers, quote unquote, in various communities to identify persons and communities to be targeted by the Home Guard. Like literally these people would just go around and say, okay, well, they look like they're probably Native American, so I'm going to go tell the Home Guard to go get them tomorrow.
This is a healthy way to live.
Yeah, it was a fun time for everybody. Technically, the Confederacy's own laws said that it could not enslave Native American people, but they sure could force them to work for free against their will at gunpoint, and that's what they did. Many of the people forced to do construction on the earthworks around Wilmington escaped over time, and the swamps and rivers in this contested territory between North and South Carolina, because the boundaries were constantly being argued even between the states. They made an excellent place to hide out. A lot of people also avoided conscription in the first place by just preemptively going into the swamps and hiding there to avoid the Home Guard when they realized that their communities were being targeted. There just were not a lot of roads in this part of the state. Again, we're talking about Robeson County. This is where the swamp and the Lumbee River sort of create this huge swath of territory that is just not terribly friendly to travel and very dense. So there were not a lot of roads, not a lot of travel. The swamps were generally considered to be impenetrable and dangerous to people who were not familiar with them to begin with. So the Lumbee people commonly helped these escapees and evaders and gave them protection, shelter, and food while everybody waited for the war to end, because everybody knew the war was going to end sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. And so people would go hide in the swamp. They would encounter the Lumbee people living in their communities in the swamps, and the Lumbee would help them out. Another source of people who were hiding in the swamps is Union soldiers who had been imprisoned in Florence, South Carolina, 60 miles away. Sometimes they would escape. They would go north. They would find themselves in the swamps of Robeson County. They would also discover their escaped slaves. They would discover people who had escaped conscription. I started to say escaped encryption. They would find people who had escaped conscription. They would find the Lumbee helping them. They would find people who were simply hiding out to avoid getting conscripted in the first place. And they were also taken in by these Lumbee communities. But the limited number of people able to work the farms, but not getting pressed into forced labor by the Confederacy, meant that more and more refugees were relying on food produced by a shrinking population of older and younger people, increasingly at risk of being the next abductees. Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, the Confederacy actively enabled local authorities and landowners to continue engaging in the long-standing practice of infringing on Lumbee land and farms, stealing them, driving them off their homesteads, and generally making it harder each year for Lumbee communities to survive. Quite literally, take their farmland and starve them out. An important point about these escapees and Union soldiers who were hiding out in the swamps is that they were generally not violent. And legally speaking, their only crime was that they didn't want to die of yellow fever building a Confederate fort. Mm-hmm. As it said in a book that I read about this called To Die Game, which is a quote from Berry Lowry. He at one point said, "If I can't live free, then I'll die game." These people were hiding from the Confederacy, not fighting it. As food became scarcer and scarcer, and as the Home Guard became more aggressive towards the end of the war, these bands of hideouts started stealing from local plantations owned by enslavers, and sometimes stealing from the Home Guard itself.
I guess I didn't realize that they had enough infrastructure to be stolen from as an entity. I always thought it was just sort of a loose band.
They had military ranks. They were paid.
Yeah, I thought they were more like contractors.
No, they were, the head of a local Home Guard would be appointed. And then that person would go get people to join their outfit. So they had ranks that perfectly mimicked the military ranks. And a lot of them were people from the military who just transitioned into the Home Guard and kept their same rank and things like that.
Gotcha.
The Home Guard would go around and they would hunt for deserters. They would look for people who had escaped enslavement.
Yeah, I knew they did that because we talked about that a lot in the Purgatory Mountain episode.
Right.
So yeah, that was just my mistaken. I just thought it was just you just kind of filed, got your card. You're just all right, I'm in the Home Guard now, and I'm a private contractor, and I'll go round these people up and get paid at the fort. I didn't realize it was actually organized.
Yeah, no, the hunter from that story, he had a military ranking and got a military salary. And as a member of the Home Guard, his job was simply to go force people into the military.
Mm-hmm.
They actually also had their own facilities. They had their own like weapons caches. They had their own uniforms. They had everything. And sometimes the people hiding out in the swamp would steal from them because they had the best stuff at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And by 1863, the Lumbee had, generally speaking, become decidedly anti-Confederacy and pro-Union. And the number of Union soldiers who had escaped from Florence, from the prisoner camp there, and were hiding in the swamps around them had begun to increase. So they started stealing food to survive, but they were accused, whether falsely or otherwise, of stealing weapons as well. And on at least one occasion, someone did steal arms and ammunition from a Home Guard armory in Lumberton around this time.
Why wouldn't you?
Right.
If you're robbing the place anyway.
I mean, you got to get a gun to go hunting if you're going to live, you know? This is how the events later described as the Lowry War started.
Always good to have a war named after yourself.
Yes.
It's like they say, if you get a rule, every rule is created because somebody did something.
Yeah.
The peak of the misbehaving is to have a rule named after you. I think a war now goes above that.
That steps it up a little. Yeah. Prior to the winter of 1864 and 65, Union soldiers who'd escaped from Florence and those people of color hiding out in the swamp had relied on the generosity mostly of relatives and locals who were sympathetic to their situations. But during that winter, they became sufficiently desperate and community support was so strained that they started raiding local plantations and stealing food, ammunition, and weapons. The local Confederate postmaster was a neighbor of Allen Lowry, Henry's father. Mm-hmm. And he accused Lowry and two of his sons of stealing 2 pigs from his plantation and slaughtering them to feed Union soldiers hiding in the swamp. And to be clear, this accusation is often considered to have been specious and to have been designed to bring really insurmountable legal repercussions on Lowry so that he would lose his farm.
Mm-hmm.
This neighbor was later ambushed and shot, but didn't immediately die. He screamed for help while his attackers escaped. And when people came running to help him, he told them that it had been Henry Berry Lowry who shot him. Again, it's kind of not known whether that's true. Then the neighbor died from the gunshot wound. A month later, in January of 1865, Henry Berry Lowry was accused of killing a Confederate conscription officer. The conscription officer had been stalking a Lumbee woman who was already in a relationship and harassing her very directly. So when she and her boyfriend told him to leave the woman alone, the conscription officer decided to perform a preemptive strike, killed the wrong person, thinking he was killing the boyfriend or somebody else in the family in order to make his point, and he wound up murdering a Lowry.
Ooh.
Then, to cover the conscription officer's tracks, and he hoped prevent retaliation for the murder he just committed, this conscription officer framed 2 members of the Lowry family for desertion by writing out paperwork that said that they had been conscripted and then escaped, even though they never had been.
Mm-hmm. It was a different time, you see. There wasn't, you could just do that.
Yeah, you could just do that. Then he took them into custody, murdered them while in his custody, and claimed that he had had to kill them in self-defense. And he's doing all this thinking, if I kill enough people, then nobody will be able to come after me for having killed the wrong person.
Yeah, that's this is an interesting approach that involves a whole lot of murder. Well, if I murder more, the first murder will go unnoticed.
One of my favorite quotes from the TV show Strangers as Candy is, look, sometimes things get out of hand. And this conscription officer was really letting things get out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
So the Confederate authorities actually didn't believe him and his account, and they issued a warrant for his arrest, but then they didn't act on it. In order to placate members of the community, they said, oh yeah, we're going to arrest that guy. We realize that what he's done is wrong. And they wrote out a warrant, and they just stuck that in a filing cabinet and never did anything with it.
We're going to hang this right on the fridge.
Yeah, right. Later, this conscription officer was ambushed and shot, and his body is presumed to have been hidden because people heard the attack happen and found his carriage, but his body was nowhere to be found and was never found.
He went out for milk. He went down the corner for milk, Michael. That's all that happened.
Exactly. And people at the time in the community suspected that maybe if Henry Berry Lowry had killed the postmaster who had accused his family of stealing pigs, then maybe he had also killed this conscription officer for having stalked someone in their community. Again, nobody really knows whether he actually did those things. And all of this was happening in the context of the approach of Sherman's army, which was just about to march straight through Lumberton on their way north from South Carolina. The Confederate regime knew that they were days, maybe weeks at most, from being removed. And instead of deciding to dial back or make their escape or anything like that, they decided to ramp up all of their harassment of the locals to get in as much as they could before they were removed from power, especially against civilians and especially against free people of color, because they thought that once the Union marched through, they would have to stop all that sort of abuse.
Get it in now, boys.
That's pretty much literally the way that they approached it. This meant larger and more frequent home guard patrols, harassing and stealing from people throughout the Carolinas, but especially around Lumberton and among the Lumbee people. They were directly in the path of Sherman's march, like I said, and they figured they had to get it in while the getting was good. So in March of 1865, 2 months after this conscription officer had been killed, one of Henry Berry Lowry's brothers, Calvin Lowry, had gone to work his field alone while most of his family and friends remained in hiding due to these increased home guard raids. The home guard saw Calvin working his field and saw that he had a rifle nearby, and they arrested him for possessing a weapon. And then they used that as a pretext to search the neighboring farm owned by his and Henry Berry Lowry's father, Allen, where they claimed they found parts of guns stashed in the barn. And that claim is contested to this day. There are people who have very strong opinions about whether or not that claim was true. And it is sort of widely believed that the Home Guard planted stolen guns, stolen goods, etc., on people as a reason to seize their property. The Home Guard arrested Allen Lowry, Henry's father, for the murder of the neighbor who had accused them of stealing pigs, saying that the hidden guns were evidence, that they must have used these guns to kill that neighbor, and then they broke the guns apart into pieces and hid the pieces so that nobody would be able to link them to these murders. Many other Lowrys, both men and women, were arrested at the same time, and they were all held in a smokehouse in town being used as a makeshift jail while the Home Guard tried to figure out what they could charge these people with. So the Confederate officers of the Home Guard held what they called a trial, in which they were the prosecutors, they allowed no defense, and they were also literally the jury. But in practice, this trial was half a dozen members of the Home Guard just sitting in a barn, going back and forth between the barn and the smokehouse, asking the people they were holding in the smokehouse questions periodically, and then saying, okay, based on what they just said, what can we charge them with? To give you a sense of just how bananas this was, they wouldn't even allow the accused in the room with them while they decided their fate. So there was no resemblance to an actual judicial process here.
Right.
Also, during this trial, people connected to the Home Guard and to the Confederate power structure tried to use the trial as a bargaining chip with the Lowrys for land and forced labor.
Forced labor from who?
Right?
Locked them all up.
Like a white plantation owner went into the smokehouse and told Allen Lowry that he, quote, could get him clear of being shot, end quote, if Allen Lowry would work for him for 6 months the next growing season for free, which also, of course, would mean that there was nobody to work Lowry's farm, so he would grow less, maybe nothing, and end up having to sell the farm.
I'd be like, oh, yeah, 6 months from now? Yeah, I'll see you then. Yeah, let me out. Sounds good. I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today.
Right. I have a feeling that Allen wouldn't have been able to get very far. It's worth noting that according to Die Game, Evans's book on this was so close to the arrival of Sherman's troops that the fires from South Carolina and Georgia could be smelled in North Carolina all the time that this was happening. Think about this summer when there were Canadian wildfires and we could smell the smoke here and we were getting air quality alerts here. It is exactly like that, except that the fires were the ones that Sherman had set across the South.
Crazy.
The trial found Lowry's father and one of his brothers guilty, quote unquote, sentenced them to death, and then drove them in a wagon out to their farm and shot them in the yard. And according to common belief, Henry Berry Lowry watched this from the bushes.
Jeez.
The next day, he and some friends and other relatives were able to gain the release of some of the people who were being held in the smokehouse, went back to their farm, buried their father and brother who had just been left exposed.
Create an insurgency in 3 easy steps.
Right. And the same day, the Home Guard forced 2 of the Lowrys who were still being held to, quote, take them to where Union soldiers are hiding. They were just like, you're Lumbee, you probably know where they're Union soldiers, take us to some. The brothers took them to a cave that they said they knew Union soldiers had used in the past, but nobody was using it at the time. And the Home Guard eventually released everybody and said they would be watching the Lowrys and their associates for any sign of assisting people who had escaped.
Yeah, congratulations. You just created an insurgency out of a gigantic family.
Yeah, exactly. There were 12 children. Alan and Mary Lowry had 12 children. They were all adults at this point. They were all perfectly capable people. They were charismatic and intelligent folks. And the Home Guard had just made all of them violently anti-Confederacy. Sherman showed up. His troops marched through. Evans notes that there were people hoping the Union Army would stop and actually expel the Confederate authorities and the Home Guard. But Sherman wanted to keep marching. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the Home Guard and the Confederate authorities basically just like stepped aside while Sherman marched through town and then immediately resumed business as usual, only even worse. Because then they said, well, the worst thing that can possibly happen has happened and nobody made us stop doing this. So we're going to go back to it, just hammer and tongs. Especially they targeted the Lowry family because they were mad that the Lowrys had basically slipped their grasp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Generally speaking, though, things actually cooled off in the region once the Civil War was officially over, at least on paper. Theoretically, 1865 passed peacefully with North Carolina as part of the 2nd Military District under the Union's military occupation of the South. But in practice, nothing really changed. The Home Guard was officially dissolved, but a new organization was created in its place called the Police Guard. And it was also referred to as the militia. They drew on a post-revolutionary structure for self-defense forces for that name. Mm-hmm. And members of the Home Guard were generally hired directly into the Police Guard with the same powers, the same titles, the same power structure, everything. They just like unfurled a different banner on the sign outside, and that was it. They said, that's it. We're totally different. We're a totally different organization now. We have satisfied the law. And the Union's failure to stick around and drive out Confederate power structures meant, generally speaking, the Confederate power structure in places like Robeson County was temporarily inconvenienced. But during this time and up until 1868, all the positions of official and practical power in local and state government were still held by Confederates. The Confederacy had banned political parties. And technically, former Confederates had to take loyalty oaths to the Union and disclose past affiliations with Confederate power structures before they could hold any offices or positions of power after the war.
Which I'm sure they did.
Oh, yeah. And those affiliations were supposed to disqualify them from holding positions of power after the war. But in practice, the former Confederates simply formed a new state-level political party called the Conservatives. Many of them were actually former members of the Whig Party, a largely conservative political party who went under in the 1850s. And their members and ideas filtered into both the modern Republican and Democratic parties. The terms that I'm going to use for political parties in this episode may be the names of parties that still exist, but they're so far removed from their policies of 150 years ago that it's kind of meaningless. It's sort of
the listeners at home, can you please repeat that? Because I feel like this is going to really split people if they don't recognize what you're saying right now.
So the parties that exist now have the same names and may technically be the same organizations as the parties that existed then, but they have changed positions and moved along the political spectrum so significantly since then that the things I'm going to say about each party then do not apply in any way to the parties that exist now.
Here at Arcane Carolinas, we take a non-political approach to history. Please don't get offended if the name of the party that you like is talked about here, because it's not even the one you like.
And both parties are in many significant ways descended from the same political party that predated the Civil War. The Whigs, The Whigs were a pro-business, conservative political party that did not take a firm position on slavery. And as a result, when the enslavement of people became the central political question in the United States, the Whig Party went under because it split.
Mm-hmm.
Some Whigs joined the former Democratic Republican Party.
Would you say they flipped their wig?
I would say that they flipped their wig.
There's not a lot of opportunities for me to like jump in and crack wise on these ones. So if you're like, why isn't Charlie saying anything? Like, well, I'm trying to just, find the right time.
And like some Whigs, Northern Whigs especially, didn't really have a party to join because the Republican Party was a very small regional party at the time, strictly limited to New England. But Whigs sort of filtered into that, and that was part of how they became a national party. Anyway, both parties today ultimately are descended from the same party in the first half of the 19th century in a lot of ways.
Ooh.
But, right.
But I thought we couldn't even converse to other human beings that don't belong to the same thing as us.
Well, these days, those roots are pretty distant.
Yeah.
The Confederacy had recognized that partisan politics had been part of what led to its own creation.
Mm-hmm.
And so...
Say that again.
And so because partisan politics had led to its own creation, the Confederacy said... no partisan politics. They just banned the organization of political parties within their region. As a result, really what they had was one party, and it was called the Confederate Party. Right. And that was that.
Join my party. It's the pizza party.
They liked to say that they were about, democracy and et cetera, but it's not exactly democracy when there's one party on the ballot. There are lots of places in the world where that happens today and make a good example of that. By the way, if any of the commentary on the state of politics or the media at the time sounds familiar, I'm sure it's just a coincidence.
What's old is new. What's new is old. Circle of life. Somebody needs to reset the simulation. We need to...
Right? Yeah. The Matrix is glitching pretty hard. The Confederate Party, which was officially banned, simply reorganized as something called the Conservative Party. And they went back to business as usual as well. In Robeson County, for instance, the justices of the peace under the Confederacy remained the justices of the peace under Reconstruction. The sheriff remained the sheriff, and the home guard became the police guard. And that was that. And it's important to take a second to talk about justices of the peace, because they were an office that existed prior to the Civil War, and they still exist. But prior to the Civil War, they had a ton of power. They were lifetime appointees. Each county would have multiple justices of the peace appointed by the governor at some point.
Now they just sign marriage certificates at the courthouse.
Yeah.
I'm sure they do more than that. If there's a justice of the peace out there that has that job, I'm sorry.
At the time, though, they were effectively the county commissioners and the county court and the sheriff. They had investigative powers, they had arrest powers, they had prosecutorial powers, they had judicial powers, and they had legislative powers. They were a council of people, each of whom was technically equal, and the lines between who among the justices of the peace in a given county would handle what were totally up to those justices of the peace. So if you wanted something investigated in your county and you went to a justice of the peace who said, I don't care, then you could just go to another one.
Justice shopping.
Right, yeah. And the other one might dig into it and say, okay, there's something here. I'm going to issue an arrest warrant and get somebody arrested and then take them in front of the other justices to serve as the court. And the other justices would say, we don't care. And there's that.
Can I share a justice of the peace story really quick? Because you keep saying that and it keeps making me think of this.
Sure.
My wife and I, when we got married, we did a justice of the peace thing because we were just like, whatever, we'll do that. And then we'll throw a party. So that's how we did it. My dad thought it would be nice to offer the justice of the peace a bottle of wine because they got us in the day before Thanksgiving because family was in town. And it was like, well, let's just do it now. I mean, if we're going to do it this way, let's just family's here. It'll be nice. It'll be fun. So we went. My dad's like, here you go. Thanks for getting us in on the schedule. We know that you weren't really going to be here today at this time. Otherwise, she was so serious. I cannot accept that. It could be perceived as a bribe.
Yeah.
And he was like, okay, I'll just leave it in the hall. She was like, it will be thrown out. He was like, that last one was a little extreme. Okay. We'll be taking that with us now. Thank you.
She was a lot better at being a justice of the peace than justices of the peace in the first half of the 19th century.
There you go. That's my justice of the peace story. Don't offer gifts, even if they do you a favor.
Justices of the peace at the time were literally the aristocracy of the county.
Mhm.
It was not an inherited title in the same sense, but it was a lifetime appointment from the governor. And the only way you got a new justice of the peace is if the old one died.
Well, it sounds like in this part of the woods, that happens a lot. Acute death syndrome.
They were also referred to at the time as squires.
Not as cool. Not as cool. I just pictured a pointy hat with a feather and a lute. And he's just like following the knight around, just like, what do you need now? I'll sing you a song. I'll carry your sword.
In the sense that they sometimes existed simply to rubber stamp whatever the home guard wanted to do, it's not that distant of a comparison.
Yeah.
In Evans's book, he refers to them as the squirearchy because, like, they were the people in charge and were going to be in charge until they died.
That would be an amazing name for a band that just plays. So Squire is like the budget brand of Fender. So Fender Guitar's budget brand is Squire. Imagine a band that was like only played Squire instruments. We are the Squirearchy.
That'd be really funny.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
They go out of tune a lot.
There were some justices of the peace who favored the common people over plantation owners and would try to work within the system, even under the Confederacy, to try to ease common people's suffering and oppression.
Sure.
But they were pretty few and far between. They were highly regarded outside the institutions that they helped staff. But generally speaking, local and state authorities were not exactly friendly to the Lumbee or to enslaved persons or to any minority or to free people of color or anything other than white people with money. If that sounds familiar, I'm sure it's just a coincidence. So, did you know that there was more than one Reconstruction?
No, probably. I probably learned about it in high school and forgot.
Plenty of us remember like Reconstruction from history class.
Right.
That period after the Civil War when the federal government mandated new state constitutions and they barred former officials and et cetera, et cetera. But in actuality, there were two Reconstructions. There was presidential Reconstruction and there was congressional Reconstruction.
Reconstruction 2, Reconstructioner.
That's actually not inaccurate.
This time we're doing it again.
More like this time we're doing it and actually meaning it.
Right.
Presidential Reconstruction's entire goal was let's just get things back to how they were before the war as quickly as possible.
Sure.
And Congressional Reconstruction was let's change the way the South worked.
Okay.
Lincoln had started planning for what to do to reintegrate the southern states back into the normal function of the United States as early as 1863, when he started issuing proclamations about how Reconstruction would begin once the South surrendered. And this was all completely new territory for the government because nothing in the Constitution really covered how to handle this particular problem. And that meant everybody had their preferred plan and everybody was pretty sure they were right. Lincoln's plan was referred to as the 10% plan. And it stated that any state that seceded could hold elections and reclaim their seats in Congress once 10% of their voting population, i.e., white men, had taken an oath of loyalty to the U.S. Constitution and to abide by emancipation, and thus had their U.S. citizenship reinstated. And Lincoln's 10% plan explicitly said that any Confederate official, any U.S. Army or Navy officer, or any U.S. judge or congressman who abandoned their office or post to join the Confederacy's government or military was excluded from being pardoned and could not have their citizenship reinstated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that delineation's important.
Oh, yeah. I think that's very important. The Republican Party was newly national. Lincoln was not technically a Republican. He had run on the National Union Party ticket with a Democrat as his running mate.
I run on the Western Union ticket. Aha, money order joke. Didn't see that coming.
Oh, God.
I don't know. It's not a good joke.
I just got it.
There's not a lot to do in this episode.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. This one is like, sort of relentlessly serious.
Yeah, I'm just like, haha, oppression. Oh, murder.
The murders have only just begun.
Oh, good.
But because the Republican Party had been a really powerful regional party in the region that was basically left in Congress, then the Republican Party controlled Congress through the Civil War. And most Republicans, who were referred to at the time as the moderates, supported Lincoln's plan, or at least supported the idea of getting the southern states fully back into the Union and participating in the federal government as quickly as possible, and of letting the executive branch administer it.
On the streets, they were called the mods. They would ride tiny Vespa scooters and fancy suits.
They all dressed like it was the 60s, because it was the 60s, the
1860s.
There was a smaller but very powerful group of Republicans called the Radicals. They were far more progressive.
Radical.
Yes, they all had skateboards. And
I'm making this fun. I don't care. You've broken me. I can crack wise in this part.
Okay, good. Like the radical Republicans, they wanted real change.
Air guitar.
Yes. They wanted like real change. They wanted to really restructure the society in the South. They were concerned that a lenient Reconstruction policy would allow the Southern aristocracy to just retake control of all the governments there and re-enslave African Americans. Literally re-enslave them. There was no legal or constitutional requirement to preserve emancipation. And they knew that former Confederate state governments would simply reinstitute slavery the second they were back in power and then fight it out in the courts. They would just take the federal government to court over the Emancipation Proclamation, and in the meantime would just literally re-enslave people. The radical Republicans had been bolstered by an influx over the previous decade or two of hundreds of thousands of German immigrants who had moved to America.
We are looking to get more radical. We have heard you are radical. Awabanga, my dudes.
It's funny you say that, because they had mostly moved here after a failed socialist revolution in Germany.
Yeah.
In fact, Karl Marx, who was at the time in London working as a newspaper reporter, wrote extensively about the American Civil War and exchanged letters with President Lincoln. They referred to each other as friends.
Huh.
Lincoln and Karl Marx were buds.
We are pen pals.
And like they would exchange letters that would be like printed in newspapers so that everybody could see that Lincoln really liked Marx and Marx really liked Lincoln. And Marx wrote about the American Civil War, but in all of his reporting, he referred to it as the American Anti-Slavery War.
Huh. That's not one that you learn in history class. I did not know that.
Marx wrote at the time that the two most important struggles in the world were Russian serfs seeking freedom and enslaved people in the United States seeking emancipation.
Yeah, I did not know that.
Yeah. So Republicans had taken in a ton of socialist immigrants and become a party that had a wing that was very radically progressive and wanted really rapid structural change to society. The radical Republicans wanted a Reconstruction plan.
It's not going to stop being funny.
It's, get all your skateboarding out now, because it will stop being funny in about 5 minutes.
Oh, I don't like the way this is headed now. I'm going to go back to being sad and serious. Tell me more, Michael.
Okay. Have more sadness, Charlie. It's like the saddest gravy. Have more sadness. So at any rate, the radical Republicans wanted what they called a 50% plan.
We just want 50%, dude.
Yes. They wanted emancipation written into the Constitution.
Write it down.
And they were definitely down with specific parties. And they wanted Southern states to draft new constitutions forbidding slavery so that Southern governments could not just re-enslave people.
You got to redo your stuff. It is not radical. I'm taking full advantage until this gets sad again.
Okay. Well, get ready. Lincoln got assassinated.
This is not righteous.
When Lincoln was killed, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, had been the only Southern senator to remain in Congress. He was a war Democrat, was called a war Democrat at the time, who were Democrats, mostly Northern Democrats, who said, yeah, if there has to be a war to keep the Union together, then make it happen. The Democratic Party, in much the same way that the Whigs fell apart because they didn't take a stand on enslavement of people, the Democratic Party had fallen apart because it did. Northern Democrats were generally not in favor of slavery and they were not in favor of secession. And they were perfectly happy for there to be a war if that's what it took. Mm-hmm. And so Johnson had been what was called a war Democrat. There were also war Democrats in the South, but he kept his seat in the Senate during the war. And then Tennessee, which was retaken almost immediately by the Union, he was appointed the military governor of Tennessee by Lincoln, in addition to also in 1864 being Lincoln's vice president. He was essentially on board with the 10% Reconstruction plan, but he issued a new proclamation with one addition to Lincoln's plan, and that was that no one with $20,000 or more of property could have their citizenship reinstated, regardless of whether they had been a member of the Confederate government or military, unless they got a pardon from Johnson personally. Johnson really hated the people in charge in the South.
I get that.
He really hated the Southern aristocracy, and he wrote that he wanted them to beg.
That's a real come kiss the ring moment.
Yeah, it's very much that. And they did come begging.
Of course they did.
In the time that he was president, he issued 13,000 personal pardons to reinstate the citizenship of various wealthy Southern landholders. 13,000.
I am not naive enough to also think there's probably some bottles of wine left here and there during this process.
Probably. Yeah. I don't think he was too concerned.
Yeah.
And so as a result, by the end of 1865, months after the end of shooting a war between the states, most Southern states had ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except for convicted criminals. Don't get me started. But had not done anything to extend voting rights to citizens who were Black men, and had not done anything to rewrite their constitutions to say that they would not just immediately start reenslaving Black people. But Johnson declared that in his view, Reconstruction was over. It was all a big success. Unfurl the banner, mission accomplished. Everybody go back to business as usual. Because he was getting what he really wanted out of it, which was get everything back to the way things had been as quickly as possible and make rich Southerners ask him to be let back in. In fact, because of Johnson's easy use of the pardon pen, a bunch of former Confederate officials, including its former vice president, showed up at the Capitol in D.C. in December of 1865, again, months after the war's end, claiming they were there to rejoin Congress because they had all had seats in Congress before the war. And they were just like, all right, we're back. Congress refused to seat them.
Did you guys change the locks? Oh, man, why?
Right? Yeah. And they made a stunt out of it. They showed up thinking that people would be sympathetic to their plight when they did this.
My code isn't working on the copier anymore. Can you tell me why that is?
Did the Wi-Fi password change? But yeah, they were just like, we're here, straight up, just like bend your voice, I'm back, baby, kind of stuff. Right. Likewise, Johnson appointed a ton of former Confederate office holders to state offices in the South under presidential Reconstruction, or allowed the election of former Confederate officials to those offices because, like I said, he just wanted things to go back to how they had been as quickly as possible.
Where is Lowry in all this?
We're getting there.
No, but he's not locked up, right?
He's not locked up. In fact, this is all during the era when things had calmed down.
Right. Okay. Yep. Sorry, I just forgot. I was just
no, that's fair.
I was in Washington D.C. in my head, and was like, wait, this is supposed to be Robin Hood of the Swamp.
Oh yeah, no, we're getting there. And at the same time, Southern states had started passing what were called the Black Codes to basically reinstate slavery by another name. And this was infuriating members of Congress. So literally, in a matter of months, it kind of looked like the entire war and all 600,000 dead people had been for nothing, with the exception of the 13th Amendment existing. And otherwise, the country was kind of back to square one. As an example, the person elected governor of North Carolina in 1865's special election had been the state treasurer under the Confederacy. In response, the views of Republicans in general in Congress started shifting towards the radicals' position, and they started passing laws, which Johnson would veto, but then they would override, called Congressional Reconstruction. And those were aimed at a much more restrictive, much more punitive approach to readmitting secessionist states back into the Union. That created two conflicting and overlapping reconstructions in which Johnson would find out that a commander in the field in the military districts reconstructing the South was a radical Republican or sympathized with radical Republicans, and he would remove them from their military post and appoint somebody who was a member of the Conservative Party, i.e., allied with former Confederates, because he knew that they would just want things to go back to how they were. And Congress would create new parts of the federal bureaucracy to try to get around that, to enforce their vision for how the South should be reconstructed. All of that led to the creation of things like the Freedmen's Bureau, which existed as a federal agency until the 1870s. And its purpose was to ensure that the work agreements signed by former enslaved people were fair and that they got paid, and to investigate crimes against people who had formerly been enslaved or were free people of color or were referred to otherwise as refugees. And that all sets the stage for what actually became the Lowry War. In December of 1865, so 9 months after his father had been arrested and executed by the Home Guard, Lowry was arrested by the, quote, police guard, the same people, in the middle of his own wedding reception on the accusation that he had killed that neighbor that said that Alan Lowry had stolen pigs.
But Alan Lowry had already been executed for that murder.
Yes. The same neighbor whose murder had already led to the execution of Alan Lowry, they showed back up and said, whoops, it was actually Henry Lowry, and we're here to get you in the middle of your wedding. The arrest did not happen as a simple serving of a warrant. It happened by the police guard showing up en masse at the wedding reception and saying either Lowry would go with them or they would shoot him on the spot. His wedding had not been officiated by a minister. Instead, it was officiated by one of those justices of the peace.
Ah.
So when they threatened Lowry, that justice of the peace started arguing with them about the legal basis for them being there to arrest him.
Mm-hmm.
The police guard all pulled their guns out. The justice of the peace got in front of Lowry, and everybody else at the wedding sort of scattered. The account that Evans gives is that there were 200 people there, and about half of them just immediately left. Understandably.
All right, man. Congratulations. Talk to you later. Bye. Good party.
But the remaining 100 people were also ready to kind of throw down with the police guard.
Mm-hmm.
To the point that the justice of the peace led the remaining guests in following the police guard as they took Lowry away, literally just like shouting at them as they all walked down the road, saying, you're not allowed to do this. The guards then turned around and started beating guests at the party with the butts of their rifles and arrested the justice of the peace and said that he was getting in the way of them executing a warrant. The next day, they released that justice of the peace, quote, on the promise he will behave better in future. And the police guard got the Robeson County Court to issue a warrant for Lowry's arrest, because it turned out there wasn't even a warrant against him. They had just decided that since he was getting married and having a party that day, they were going to show up and bust it up, and we'll figure out what to charge him with later. Lowry was put in jail in a neighboring county, but managed to escape. Evans notes that Lumbee tradition is that Lowry's new bride brought him a cake with a file in it, and he used that to escape. And that's not the origin of that trope, but that is an example of somebody having been inspired by that trope, which at the time was a pretty widespread idea already.
Love it.
Once Lowry escaped, he, some of his brothers, and a few friends, some black, some Lumbee, some white, reformed their band and started hiding out in the swamp to evade arrest on numerous charges that were now floating around against them.
Hierarchy!
And during this time, they became political activists, and they started marching in parades being held by the Republican Party, which was newly national and newly radical, and was promising racial justice for people who had been abused by the Confederacy. That's why all that was important stage setting, which all leads into the midterm elections and local elections of 1866 and 1868. Due to the requirements, like I said, for individuals in the South to be pardoned and to have their vote restored by taking a loyalty oath, and due to various parts of Congress's Reconstruction Acts under Congressional Reconstruction requiring Southern states recognize the right of men of color to vote, the 15th Amendment had not yet been passed. So they were saying, okay, states, you have to pass laws saying that black men can vote. And due to a huge upswell of support for the Republican Party after the successful completion of the Civil War, the Republicans had a platform of explicitly seeking to address racial and economic justice, especially for Black Americans and for poor working people, regardless of race. The Republicans also positioned themselves from the outset as the party of law and order, particularly in response to racist violence by former Confederates. Elements of the Home Guard, the former Home Guard, the new police guard, former Confederate officials, and others were talking openly at the time about forming a secret force to reenact the effective enslavement of Black Americans, and former Confederates had begun racist violence, especially at polling places and in majority Black communities, immediately upon the end of the war. And today, we know those people as the Klan.
Right. I'm like, oh, I know where this is going.
Yeah. The election of 1866 saw sweeping Republican victories at the state and federal levels. State legislatures that previously had been mostly still occupied by former Confederate legislators under the Conservative Party banner all got handed over to the Republicans. And at the time, the Republican Party had really started to lean into the radical Republican view. So Congress then required Southern states to write new constitutions and gave deadlines for this to happen. And the new constitutions had to guarantee the rights of Black people, including voting rights. So that by 1868, North Carolina had a new constitution, and the old power structures of the justices of the peace, for instance, had been totally erased and replaced with structures that we recognize today: county commissioners, county courts, that sort of thing. Republicans were still actively engaging in the pursuit of racial justice through legislation, though, and like I said, had established the Freedmen's Bureau, which worked to ensure hiring agreements involving formerly enslaved persons were fair, but also they investigated crimes against anyone categorized as a refugee under the terms of the agency's creation. There was a huge amount of optimism at the time among marginalized people, including the Lumbee, that things were really about to change. And as such, Lowry and his friends who had formed the Lowry Band stopped doing anything to steal from plantations or from the police guard or anything, and became peaceful citizens. Evans, in his book, To Die Game, notes that there were 0 robberies or burglaries reported anywhere in Robeson County for 6 months after the new state constitution was put in place and new institutions of government took over. Like, people really believed things are going to change for the better now. And everyone essentially settled into a waiting game. Lowry and his relatives and friends went and got regular jobs, despite technically still being wanted criminals, because technically those warrants against them that he had been arrested under at his wedding still existed. But they just wanted to see, would things really improve?
Right.
And former Confederates were waiting to see if Lowry's band would move back out into the open so that they could take revenge on them for having aided the Union in their perception. And the Reconstruction government wanted to wait to see if everything would cool off and blow over if nobody did anything for long enough.
Right.
Politics at the federal level were extremely divided, and those divisions started playing out in local elections and local power structures as well, including revenge seeking by former Confederates who remained in power in some way and really wanted to punish people. And despite the Justice of the Peace who had tried to defend Lowry actually being elected to the newly instated Board of County Commissioners, as well as 2 of Lowry's fellow Lumbee being elected to it, including another Lowry and a new sheriff of Robeson County for the first time in nearly 20 years, the local Republican leadership worried that they would lose their law and order image if they were too closely associated with the Lowrys who had turned out their communities to vote for them and marched in their parades. Meanwhile, the military authorities overseeing Reconstruction distinctly did not want to get involved and provoke the former Confederates by pursuing legal action against them for their crimes against the Lumbee. Thus, even though a Freedmen's Bureau agent investigated the killing of Lowry's father and brother, the incident that had started all of this, and wrote up charges against the members of the former Home Guard and now Police Guard who had carried out those murders, and turned those charges in to the Robeson County courts, which newly existed, the local prosecutor declined to try any of them, and the military authorities refused to step in and try them themselves. But the courts and county prosecutor did pursue charges against Lumbee for various crimes, real or imagined, and the former Home Guard, who were now the Police Guard, were routinely sent into the swamp to harass, attack, and arrest them for charges on lesser crimes. Again, this is how you get an insurgency.
Right.
This led to widespread dissatisfaction over unkept promises. And in October of 1868, a series of raids on plantations and robberies of stores were attributed to the Lowry Band, even though none of the perpetrators had been identified. This happened at the same time that the governor received 2 petitions from different levels of government: a Republican sheriff in New Hanover County and former Confederates who were now with the Conservative Party in Robeson County, asking him to declare that the governor would still honor an old bounty on Lowry's head, $300 dead or alive. And that $300 was 4 times the annual earnings of the average tradesman in 1868.
Pretty significant.
Pretty significant. Now, even more worried about losing that law and order image if the government did nothing, the governor announced that he would honor the bounty. And in fact, the state issued new charges of outlawry just to make sure that nobody could argue that the old charges were no longer valid because they had been issued by the Confederacy.
General outlawry.
Yeah. And that's right. It's funny that that was a charge that they could just bring.
You're a ne'er-do-well.
Yeah. In light of this new declaration of hostility between the state and Lowry, and knowing that this would split local opinion, the newly elected Republican sheriff of Robeson County and the newly appointed Freedmen's Bureau agent for Robeson County met with Lowry, who, in fact, served them dinner and played fiddle for their entertainment, and negotiated that Lowry would turn himself over on condition of being specially protected. That he would not be placed in irons, he would be given 3 meals a day in jail instead of 2, and he would be held in a less uncomfortable part of the jail, the debtor's wing, instead of being housed with the rest of people who've been accused of violent crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And that there would be special guard in place to protect him from the white residents of Lumberton. All parties agreed to these terms, and Lowry peacefully accompanied them to Lumberton and entered jail to await trial on charges of outlawry. But a rumor started that former Confederates were going to break into the jail because the debtor's wing was less guarded generally.
Right.
And the sheriff had not lived up to the promise to have beefed up security, and that they would kill Lowry, and that the Republican sheriff was going to allow it to happen so that the matter would sort of be settled once and for all, and everybody could forget about this. And once that rumor got around, then Lowry started making plans to escape again. In December of 1868, Lowry's nighttime jailer showed up, and he drew a gun and knife while in his jail cell, and without hurting anybody, forced the jailer into the cell, locked it up behind himself, walked out of the jail, walked out of the town of Lumberton, and went back to the swamp. And that was that. And in part, he went back to the swamps because there, among people who were still actively being hunted and murdered by former Confederate officials, Lowry was recognized as simply having tried to survive, even if he committed the murders he had been accused of.
Right.
And in fact, as having been so interested in a peaceful life that he had turned himself over to authorities in order to save everybody else from being further harassed. But those legal authorities did not live up to their end of the bargain out of political expediency. In January of 1869, a month later, Lowry's band surprised the old sheriff, this guy named Reuben King, who had been a Confederate and whom most of the old Confederates in town treated as though he were still the sheriff, even though he had lost the 1868 election. The Conservative Party in Robeson County said that they considered the new state constitution and any elections held under it, if they lost, to be illegitimate. And so half the county refused to recognize the new sheriff, continued to treat King as if he were still sheriff. If they won any elections, they said those were legitimate. If this sounds familiar, I'm sure it is coincidence. And on the night in question, King and a guest were sitting by the fire reading newspapers when Lowry just walked into the living room and said, "I'm here for all your gold and silver." King was hated by everyone who was not a former Confederate official or a plantation owner, and local and state Republicans had tried repeatedly to have him removed from office before actually beating him at the ballot box. When Lowry demanded his gold and silver, King leapt out of his chair to charge at Lowry, and a member of Lowry's band, reputed at the time to be this guy named George Applewhite, shot King before he reached Lowry. King died, and that was it. The Lowry War was on. One of the practical results of the two reconstructions was, like I said, Johnson had replaced most radical Republican-aligned commanders or commanding officers in the South with ones who were somewhere between being moderates and conservatives. And the appointed Republican officials, or the people who had won elections under the new Constitution, were having trouble finding military leaders who knew the local landscape and population and were anything other than former Confederates, which is why the Home Guard had been forgiven, even more leniently than Lincoln wanted, by being turned into the police guard. Frankly, there just wasn't anybody around who knew how to command a militia and had done so for anyone other than the Confederacy. This resulted in a number of prominent local former Confederates failing upwards, if you will, after the war, including a guy named Owen Normant. Normant came from a prominent family, including a judge, That prosecutor who refused to prosecute the killers of Lowry's father was one of his brothers, and other local officials were members of Norman's family. And after the war, Norman was hired into the newly formed police guard as a lieutenant, which was the rank he'd held in the Confederate Army. Then he was promoted to captain. He was widely regarded as absolutely ruthless in his conduct. And over the course of 1869, he had several skirmishes and gunfights with various members of the Lowry band because as soon as Reuben King was killed, the police guard was told, do whatever it takes to find and bring in Henry Berry Lowry and anybody working with him. And in these fights, the Lowrys and their compatriots almost always got away without injury. On one occasion, in fact, Norman, this new captain of the police guard, attended church on a Sunday morning, only to realize that Lowry was attending the same church. And Norman had not taken a weapon into church.
Well, one would hope not.
But Lowry was visibly armed.
Oh, okay.
And so Norman stopped Lowry on the church steps on their way out at the end of the service and tried to pick a verbal altercation with him.
Mm-hmm.
But Lowry's response was basically to say, I could kill you right here on the steps of a church, but I don't actually want to have a fight with you. I wanted to go to church today. So have a nice day, have a nice life, and walked off.
Right.
And Norman was incredibly angry. He had hoped that at the very least he'd get Lowry to insult him and that he would be able to use that in some way against him socially. But he couldn't get Lowry to engage. Lowry was just like, no, I'm just going to go live my life now. Peace out. And Norman became even more angry about it. He felt humiliated. The incident was widely discussed in the area as evidence that Lowry could put one over on anybody, and nobody could do the same to him. But over the course of the year, Norman had some success against the Lowry band. 8 men had been arrested and were reported in conservative newspapers to be Lowry's main lieutenants and accomplices, not unlike how for like the last 20 years, we have constantly been finding and disposing of the like third in command of Al-Qaeda. You know, it was kind of that, you know, over the course of the year, 8 people got arrested and they were all, you know, number 2 in the Lowry band.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And they were all set to be tried for outlawry and murder in the spring of 1870. This trial put local Republican political leaders in an even worse spot than they had been before. The judge was a Republican elected in the swell of optimism of 1868. And if he found Lowry's compatriots guilty, it would probably cost the Republicans local elections for years to come. But if he didn't find them guilty, then former Confederates now running for office as conservatives would use it against the Republican Party in elections. Add to it all that the 2 star witnesses that the prosecutors had found to testify against members of the Lowry band had both reneged. One, through his lawyer, stated in court that his confession had been coerced by violence, and the other escaped yet a different jail along with several of the other men awaiting trial and couldn't be located. So there was no prosecution against them that had any evidence, and most of the people who were about to be tried had escaped. Local officials were feeling very embarrassed and very nervous.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah. On March 19th, 1870, 2 weeks before this trial was set to commence, Norman, the captain of the police guard, who had been hunting Lowry since the Lowry band had killed the former sheriff, told his wife at night that he had heard a sound outside their home. They were sitting in their living room. He said, I hear something outside. She actually thought that it was something innocuous. And he said, no, I don't think it's that. He got up, walked to the front door, opened it, stepped outside, and was immediately shot. Servants in their home said that they saw, quote, a woman or a man dressed as a woman dash off into the woods after the shooting. A doctor was sent for. He was ambushed on his way to the home and thus significantly delayed, and Norman died the next morning. Simultaneous with this attack on Norman, 3 other plantations in Robeson County were raided and robbed, and everyone assumed it was Lowry and his band. 2 weeks later, 2 of the 8 men on trial were sentenced to death after being found guilty, including George Applewhite, the one who people said had shot the former sheriff. And they were found guilty on more or less no evidence other than everyone saying, well, they must have done it.
Mm-hmm.
And by this point, everyone was worried that no member of the Lowry band could possibly be kept in local jails without escaping. So while those 2 awaited execution, they were moved to the new brick-built jail in New Hanover County, 3 counties away, where it was assumed they would have no assistance from locals and no familiarity with the landscape, and where the sheriff had been one of the people to write to the governor to say, please still honor the bounties on the heads of the Lowry band. Then a couple of months later, those two men escaped the New Hanover County Jail.
Pretty leaky jails.
They're really good at getting away. The story goes that a beautiful woman distracted the special guard on duty to keep them from escaping by asking about a non-existent prisoner and insisting they must have him there, while an accomplice fed tools and files to the prisoners up through a window on a string. Then the prisoners used the tools and file to fashion a skeleton key or a lockpick to open the lock of their cell door, and then used that nightly to go upstairs to a floor above them to an empty cell and work the grout away from a section of the brick wall where nobody would notice that this was happening. Meanwhile, they studied the pattern of the guards. On a night in June 1870, they took advantage of the guard's absence while he smoked a pipe with another guard hired to watch a nearby shop. So literally the guard goes on a smoke break. The Lowry band members who are being held awaiting execution on charges that nobody can actually prove that they did, they let themselves out of their cell. They went upstairs. They removed a section of the exterior wall from that empty cell. Mm-hmm. Then they climbed down 40 feet on a rope made from bed sheets and walked away. They took 4 weeks traveling back to Robeson County because they traveled on foot, avoided the roads, and followed the Cape Fear River, taking a circuitous route through the swamps, avoiding any settlements along the way, just in case they would run into people who might recognize them from the newspapers and would not want to help them. And it is widely assumed that the woman who distracted the guards was Rhoda Lowry, Henry Berry Lowry's wife, who was regarded as a great beauty. Henry Berry Lowry apparently was also very handsome to the point that even Norman's widow described him that way in a book she later wrote. And local legends holds that she walked barefoot to Wilmington herself rather than take the train because people in the train would recognize her. So by this point, the Lowry band is assumed to have killed the old sheriff. They are assumed to have killed the old Confederate postmaster, to have killed the old Confederate conscription officer, to have killed the home guard, police guard captain who was hunting them, to have escaped jail repeatedly, and to have humiliated all office holders, regardless of politics, across the region.
This all started over 2 pigs.
It all started over 2 pigs. The local conservative party in Robeson County hired a former Boston police investigator named Saunders to move to Robeson County and pretend to be an English teacher.
Hello, I'm an English teacher.
Saunders started a small school for Lumbee children, teaching them reading and writing.
Wow. That's a lot. That's a lot.
It is. It
To
is.
start a school. It's like that Key and Peele thing where it's like, yeah, let's rob the bank. How do you want to rob the bank? First, we're going to get jobs there so we learn how it works, and we're going to work there 40 hours a week. Then we'll get a pension and a retirement fund, and we'll leave. You just described just working at the bank. Yeah. First, I'm going to pretend to be an English teacher. Then I'm going to go establish a school, and I'm going to teach those kids English.
Pretty much exactly. Like, you're not wrong at all. At all. To defray suspicion, the local conservatives convinced the Republican sheriff, the same one who had promised that Lowry would be safe in the Lumberton jail, to introduce Saunders around as his friend.
Okay.
And for people outside of political machinations, Saunders told the Lumbees that he was a radical Republican inspired to come south and teach literacy to help redress the injustices against them. And he told white conservatives that he was a member of the Klan.
Okay. Two extremes, really. Like digging himself a hole here.
He's spinning a lot of plates.
Yeah.
Saunders then settled in to wait for signs of Lowry so that he could turn the information over to the conservatives who wanted Lowry hunted down. The circuit of information was that he would send intelligence via locals who were sympathetic to the conservatives to the sheriff of New Hanover County, whose jail those members of the Lowry band had just escaped, who would then hand the information over to local members of the Conservative Party in Robeson County, who were angry because they had been hunting Lowry for years, who would then hand the information over to the state government, who had bounties against Lowry.
Okay.
Saunders sought the confidences of the Lumbee by going to churches in the area and giving talks about the injustices against them and how to go about righting those wrongs. So he was like really leaning into his cover story.
Yeah.
And he told the Lowrys and the Lumbee in general that he could facilitate them leaving the region altogether, either for the Great Plains, like well past the frontier at that point, or for Mexico, and that he would travel with them as their negotiator and guide wherever they had to interact with white society. It's important to note that given the times, they were not merely like afraid of random bigots along the way. There was no way for a band of Native Americans to travel safely a significant distance, much less ones who were wanted in 2 states and starting to become nationally famous because former Confederate newspapers, now published by members of the Conservative Party, were starting to hype them up as the Republican version of the Klan. The conservative paper in Wilmington had been running articles and editorials portraying the Lowry Band as an organization composed of hundreds of violent criminals funded by radical Republicans, and telling readers that no city, town, or road in North or South Carolina was safe, and that, the downtowns are burning and it's all mob rule.
Right.
And if any of that sounds familiar, I'm sure it's just coincidence. But actually, Saunders' plan was to get the Lowry Band to go with him to Georgia, which was far from hope of help from any relatives or friends. And then there, he would lead them to authorities. On the day they were set to depart, the Lumbees who had told Saunders they would go with him never showed up. Saunders got nervous and called a meeting with a local Scottish immigrant family who had been helping him and who had been one of his conduits of information. The Lowrys, it turned out, had cottoned on to Saunders from the very beginning, and had spent weeks and months following him and figuring out who was helping him against them. So when Saunders' accomplices showed up to meet with him, Saunders also did not show up. But the Lowrys were there waiting for these folks who had been helping Saunders.
Right.
They then spent the day and the next night sitting at that meeting spot around a fire, taking care of the accomplices and questioning them about Saunders' location. They took this Scottish immigrant family's weapons, but they were later described as having treated them very kindly. And they were described that way by the members of that Scottish family. The next morning, Saunders finally showed up, encountered the sentries around the camp, and surrendered, confessing everything. And Henry Berry Lowry called a council of 8 of his closest companions so that they could talk about what to do with Saunders now that they knew for sure what he'd been up to and who had been helping him. One of Lowry's lieutenants was this guy named Boss Strong, and he insisted that they let Saunders go on a promise to go back up north because he had recently himself escaped a firing squad and felt like that sort of summary justice was not good. But the others all voted for executing Saunders. During their deliberation, Saunders got hold of a knife and tried to slash his own wrist, but didn't succeed, and they just bandaged it up and kept debating his fate while he sat there with them. So then he told them, well, I have pills on me, and one of them is arsenic, and I'll take that right here in front of you and die from poison so that you don't have to shoot me. So they let him take this pill, and then they all camped there with him for 3 days, waiting to see if he would actually die. But he had been lying. It was not poison. He had just planned to try to fake dying, and then they would all leave him be.
Oh, I'm totally dead, you guys.
Yeah. At that point, the group cast lots, and one of Lowry's brothers shot Saunders. And Boss Strong actually stayed behind, buried Saunders at the location, took his possessions, and let him write a last letter to his wife, and then mailed all of that to his wife so that Saunders' widow would know what had happened. And as Evans points out in his book, this sort of behavior is not the behavior of seasoned killers. This is not the sort of thing that people who have shot a lot of people and murdered a lot of people are comfortable. They showed a lot of hesitation around this.
Sure.
That is not necessarily behavior one might ascribe to the sorts of people that they were being portrayed as being in the media of the time. But that was sort of the cycle for a long time. The Lowrys would raid or rob a store or a plantation owned by a white conservative. When I say conservative, that's an uppercase C. These were people who were members of the, quote, conservative party at the time. They were all former Confederates. But if you go look at the list of governors of North Carolina for this era, you'll see Democrat, 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 Republican, conservative, 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 so.
We established that in the first half.
Yeah, I just, I like to bring it up again.
Yeah, no, it's good. I do think this should be one giant episode, not necessarily a 2-parter.
Okay. Hey, we'll do it. The Lowrys would raid or rob a store or a plantation owned by a white conservative, usually one who had participated in attacks on the Lumbee or had belonged to the Home Guard or had otherwise taken an active role in oppressing Lumbee. The Lowrys would treat their victims fairly gently, however, including several instances when they did things like take a cart and horses to move what they stole. And then when they got the goods back to their homes, they would return the cart and horse. They also, several times in the course of these raids, encountered people, whether they were servants or neighbors or other people familiar to them, who everyone knew could not afford to be robbed, and they would make sure that those people were left alone. As Evans puts it, it generally came to be assumed that if anyone were robbed and in the course of it were shown courtesy, it must have been the Lowry band. They also generally distributed their stolen goods or property into the communities of the settlement. That was the term the Lumbee used for communities in that area. They called it the settlement.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see in books and articles and stuff like that this area is referred to as Scuffle Town, but that was a name used for it by white people outside of it who wanted to paint it as being violent.
Scuffleton.
Yeah. And so the actual Lumbee who lived there referred to it as the settlement. So they would take these goods and property and they would distribute it into the settlement. Like, in the case of the wagon, they'd stolen a bunch of corn. They took that corn back to the communities, and in an orderly fashion, they distributed it to households where food was scarce or work had been impossible to find. And that's what they did with it. They didn't go sell it to get rich or anything like that. They just used it to feed people. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, the Home Guard, which had been reconstituted as the police guard or as the militia, and under the control of the conservatives who no longer held office or who did hold office, and the Klan itself, and there was pretty significant overlap between the police guard and the Klan at the time, would go into the swamp, harass people, attack and murder Lumbee, face no consequences, and just like as a vigilante band would, quote, arrest someone and say that they were a member of the Lowry band. Often a member of the Lowry band would then escape, such as happened with Boss Strong, and the local Republican Party, who were the official office holders, would do nothing to help with this. The governor at the time was about to be impeached by the state legislature, and in a bid to stave that off, lifted all political restrictions and Reconstruction requirements in a number of conservative-held counties in North Carolina, but not statewide. He halted all investigations into Klan activity, and he requested that the U.S. military move into Robeson County and start hunting the Lowry band. And to make matters worse, a member of the Home Guard who had been one of the people who murdered Lowry's father got elected sheriff in 1870.
It's all connected.
It is. In actuality, the Republican sheriff won re-election by the number of ballots cast, but winners of office at the time had to pay a bond in order to take that office. And he didn't have the financial backing anymore to pay those fees. So the county court said, you can't be the sheriff. And they handed it to the person who had run on the Conservative Party ticket, this guy who had been a member of the Home Guard and had been one of the people who killed Lowry's father. And that guy, as soon as he was back in office, said, that's it, we're finding Lowry. All efforts are redoubled. And the U.S. military honored the governor's request and sent forces to find Lowry. And everybody involved was convinced, in part because of newspaper editorials by former Confederate newspapers, that the reason Lowry was still at large was because the other Lumbee who lived in the settlement were helping him. And so essentially they declared war on all Native Americans in the region. The conservative legislature at the time enacted enormous new bounties on Lowry and several members of the Lowry band, like many thousands of dollars instead of just, quote unquote, just 300. So now we're talking about decades worth of pay. And Lowry responded by offering bounties on members of the police guard, home guard militia. As Evans notes in his book, a lot of my notes come from this book called Deny Game, which is so good. But as Evans notes, people very quickly started building turkey blinds and setting ambushes, and people started forming hunting parties and traveling to Robeson County to try to find Lowry and cash in on the bounties. And all of this resulted in a bunch of very dramatic shootouts, the deaths and woundings of innocent bystanders, revenge killings that had nothing to do with Lowry and everything to do with politics. Elements of the old Home Guard operating as the militia and openly overlapping with the Klan started raiding the homes of Lumbee families, taking everything, destroying what they couldn't take, and saying that it was on suspicion of aiding outlaws. They also beat, ambushed, and killed Indians in the region. And when their surviving victims tried to take matters to the authorities, nothing was done. The militia also adopted a new policy of targeting the wives and families of members of the Lowry band in order to try to draw the Lowry band out into open conflict. And all the while, Lowry and his closest friends and families managed one unlikely escape after another.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Two prominent examples. George Applewhite, who had shot Sheriff King years before, was generally believed to have died after a particular shootout. However, in April of 1871, the new sheriff and former Confederate was out with a party of 9 others looking for ways to approach Henry Berry Lowry's house without being seen. And when they got there, more just like checking out the landscape than anything, they realized Lowry, his wife, their 3 small children, and Boss Strong and George Applewhite, who would turned out was not dead, were all there. Lowry was playing banjo for his kids inside the house, and Applewhite and Strong were working in the yard or standing guard in the yard. Mm-hmm. McMillan, the sheriff, fired a shot, and Applewhite and Strong both made it into the house unharmed. And at that point, this lengthy standoff commenced. So the sheriff left to get a larger posse because they didn't have enough people to really encircle the house. He was gone so long, he did things like catch a train to another town where there were more white people who were sympathetic to his cause, and then riding back 12 miles with those people with the new posse in tow, only to return to find the men he'd left at the cabin in the middle of a retreat. They had been firing at the cabin the entire time, trying to keep Lowry and his family pinned down, when they realized they hadn't heard any return gunfire in a while. And when they approached the cabin, they saw through the windows that it was empty, despite there having been multiple people inside. They had surrounded 3 sides of the cabin because they were firing at windows and doors, but they had not covered the blank back wall of the cabin where the chimney stood. Everybody knew that Lowry had escape tunnels that were accessible through trap doors in his cabin, but the escape tunnels had been dug up and collapsed by the U.S. Army in the course of their hunt for him. So everybody thought, well, there's no more escape tunnel. There's no way for him to get out of the house. But it turned out he also had a secret door on the back of the house, concealed so that it was not visible from outside. And from the inside, it looked like a closet. Mm-hmm. And they had all snuck out the back via that secret door. All of them, him, his wife, their 3 kids, their 2 friends, and they had taken off through the swamp. In the course of the shootout, the son of an acquaintance of Lowry had been killed. The sheriff had pressed this kid into service against the family's wishes, and Lowry sent the father a letter of apology later, saying that he had not meant for that to happen. In July of 1871, several of their wives, including Rhoda Lowry and the wife of George Applewhite, were kidnapped and taken to militia headquarters. One of the militia companies who kidnapped one of the wives was led by an officer named McRae. And after handing over their prisoner, the McRae company took a break along the Lumbee River in a spot called Wiregrass Landing. As they sat there on the bank of the river and dusk approached, they heard a paddle in the water and saw a canoe emerge. And Henry Berry Lowry happened to be in the canoe, because one of the ways that he and his band got around without being caught was they used the waterways. All these guys in McRae's company go for their rifles, and Lowry dove over the side of his own canoe into the water, grabbed his rifle out of it, tipped the canoe up to act as cover, and then started swimming towards these 18 soldiers who were firing at him, firing back. Lowry was a renowned marksman, and he managed to wound 2 of these 18 soldiers. McRae ordered the militia to retreat, and they all beat it out of there before Lowry could get to them on the bank. Everybody expected an immediate retaliation or a jailbreak attempt or something in the immediate aftermath of this, because Lowry's wife was one of the people who had been taken. Instead, everything was totally quiet for 3 days. Then Lowry and 3 of his men appeared at a local plantation around breakfast and asked to be served food. The plantation owner agreed, and by all accounts, including the book written by Norman's widow, again, they passed this amiable breakfast. After the meal, Lowry told the plantation owner to go into town and tell the sheriff that if he did not release all their wives and relations, that Lowry would begin kidnapping white women from town in retaliation. He also dictated a note that said if Lowry's relatives were not released within 3 days, that, quote, the bloodiest times will be here that ever was before. The plantation owner took the note into town and gave it to the sheriff, who instead sent word to the governor asking that he ask the feds to send more soldiers or get the soldiers out of his way. In the meantime, Lowry and his companions left this plantation owner's home and went to a different plantation, arriving there in time for lunch and receiving word as they ate lunch. Again, by all accounts, they were entirely amiable and polite. And even Mary Norman commented on this in her book, saying that he and his band were quite well-mannered and considerate in their relations with other people. As they left, Lowry told the plantation owner, none of this would have happened if we'd simply been allowed to find work. And that was his position throughout all of this. The sheriff attempted to raise a posse to go hunting for Lowry again, but he could find few men willing to volunteer because they were afraid to leave home to go hunting for Lowry, only to have Lowry kidnap their wives.
Mm-hmm.
And on the third day, as the deadline approached, a group of private citizens met with the county commissioners, and they decided, without consulting the sheriff or the militia, to let everybody go. And they put all the wives and relatives on a train back to a stop near the settlement. And there, Rhoda Lowry was greeted by an enthusiastic crowd with great fanfare. The end of the Lowry War. It should be noted that throughout this, Lowry maintained his and his group's innocence of many of the crimes of which they were accused. And in fact, by then, the militia was headed by this guy named Wishart, who was a furious hunter of Lowry. But despite that, Lowry sent word to Wishart that he wanted to meet and speak to the North Carolina Adjutant General, the person in charge of all militias across the state. And now that position still exists and is appointed by the governor and is the head of the National Guard.
Wait, what?
Yeah, the Adjutant General is still a position that exists, and it's appointed by the governor and is the head of the National Guard in the state. History's a lot shorter than we think.
Yeah, I was like, wait, now we're into modern terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wishart arranged this meeting. And the Adjutant General was this guy named Gorman. Lowry met with Gorman on multiple occasions, repeating that he and his group were innocent of a bunch of the crimes that they had been accused of. In fact, there were a ton of instances of robberies, attacks, bank heists, that sort of thing, elsewhere in the country even, during which the criminals would yell out something like, "We're the Lowry gang from North Carolina," as a way to try to throw suspicion off themselves. Like there's an example where that's what somebody yelled as they were running out of a bank in Kentucky, you know?
Sure.
Because there was a lot of national media attention on all of this. Lowry told Gorman, "I either want to be pardoned and promised to be left alone, or I want safe passage out of the state." And over months of meetings, Lowry and his band also curtailed their robberies so that they could prove that they were saying this in good faith. They were saying, "We won't rob anybody anymore. Just pardon us and let us leave." Gorman lobbied for Lowry's pardon, but the state legislature was now back in the control of the Conservative Party. Half a decade after the Civil War had been a shooting war, the old Confederate legislature was back in power. And their response was to increase the bounties on Lowry again. At that point, the bounty on Lowry was $12,000.
A lot of money.
Bounty hunters came out of the woodwork, and things got really, really bad in Robeson County. So bad, in fact, that in February of 1872, the Lowry band rode into Lumberton, stole the safe from a particular store that essentially was also the town bank, thus getting $22,000 in cash, plus $1,000 worth of merchandise, and then rode back out of town. And after that, Lowry was never seen again.
Grim.
There are two versions of what happened. One version, told at the time by one part of Lowry's family, is that Lowry and his companions were eating a meal together after the heist, preparing to leave Robeson County and go west, when Lowry accidentally shot himself and died. Personally, I find that one unbelievable. The guy was a crack shot. He had pulled off numerous escapades, like firing a rifle at 18 men from behind a canoe while swimming towards them, and having just leapt out of the canoe and being in the water and etc. And he never hurt himself with a gun during any of this. In that version of the story, Lowry's body was secretly buried by the rest of the gang to prevent anyone from collecting the bounty on him. And they did this by diverting a stream, burying him at the bottom of a creek bed, and then reverting the stream so that his grave was unfindable. The other version is that Gorman made good on one of Lowry's alternative offers, that he would leave Robeson County forever if Gorman would help him escape. According to that version, Lowry knew the only reason his wife and children were being harassed was due to his continued presence. So, for the same reason he turned himself over to authorities in Lumberton at the very beginning, he hoped that by vanishing, he could take the heat off of his family and friends and supporters. Gorman, in this version, agreed, and in some versions of the story, he simply helped Lowry disguise himself using bandages and an army uniform, loaded him onto a train, and he left and went west. But one of Lowry's nephews told later that Lowry actually joined the army with Gorman's help, where his sharpshooting and his ability to pass as white let him have easy success and no suspicion, and that he did a 4-year stint in the army before being discharged honorably and settling down in Virginia and becoming a farmer. There are people who firmly believe each of these versions, and each version was told in various forms by different nephews of Henry Berry Lowry. So there's no real way to know unless everybody decided to tell a different story to cover up what really happened.
Right.
But I choose to believe, regardless, that he got away and lived a full life. And in the meantime, his wife, Rhoda, remained in the settlement, in the house where she and he had lived since their wedding, including it being the house where they had had to escape out the secret door in the back. And for the rest of her life, refused to say whether Lowry was dead or alive.
Interesting.
At several points in this, I've mentioned that the militia or the posses or the clan, etc., the Lowry who were chasing the Lowry band and various officials in the Lowry band themselves were taking the train here and there. And at the time, a lot of people wondered how the Lowry band was able to get around so quickly and undisturbed. Mm-hmm. At the time, the Wilmington, Charlotte, and Rutherford Railroad was the railroad that ran through the settlement. Officials from the railroad refused to say at the time whether they had any sort of agreement with Lowry or with the Home Guard or the police guard or the militia or the army. But it was generally agreed later that all parties involved considered the railroad to be neutral territory. Mm-hmm. The railroad refused to allow the police guard or bounty hunters onto their trains if they were visibly armed. They said this presents an obvious danger to our passengers, so we're not going to allow that. And they allowed the Lowry band onto the trains because, as one railroad executive put it at the time, they could knock over a train anytime. So they were like, we're just not going to get in their way. But both sides seemed to treat the trains as neutral territory because they both knew they themselves needed the trains, as did their supporters, whether the residents of the settlement who supported Lowry or the white conservative party members in town who supported the sheriff and the militia in their hunt, and thus neither of them wanted to jeopardize the train in general. In fact, Evans says in To Die Game that on several occasions, members of the militia or the U.S. Army or civil authorities were seen on the trains talking to, or sometimes merely sitting near, members of the Lowry band, and suggests that maybe they were having clandestine meetings to try to negotiate some point in this years-long conflict. But after the war, the Lowry band basically gave up criminal activities. Several of them just got regular jobs and tried to go about their lives. The state legislature still wanted revenge and refused to drop the bounties. And bounty hunters continued to show up from around the country for the next 2 years. So that by 1874, only one member of the Lowry gang was still alive or at large. He was this guy named Steve Lowry, who had been one of the 2 people to escape from the brick jail in Wilmington. Mm-hmm. Lowry had lived in hiding throughout that time, but he got invited to a party at the plantation where the Lowry band had shown up and asked for breakfast.
Sure, why not?
And he went. They considered the owner of that plantation fairly friendly to them at that point, in part because he was one of the people that they had tried to rob thinking he was rich, only to discover that he had no cash after the war. And so they let him keep his stuff. And he accepted an invitation to play banjo on stage in the yard during the party. And as he picked up the banjo, 3 different bounty hunters opened fire and killed him instantly. And that was the last incident of the Lowry War. And officially, it was considered over. The Lowry War and the cumulative effects of many factors of the Civil War and the 2 Reconstructions led the Lumbee people, though, to engage directly with state and federal authorities in seeking resources and compensation so that they could protect their history and try to build a better future. And remember that phrase from the very beginning, they sought shelter from a world that had made it perilous to be Indian. And I think it's demonstrated in this story that that was very much the case. I went looking for information about how the state government approached handling the Lumbee people, and I found this in a letter from 1914 written by a Bureau of Indian Affairs official, that was a federal agency, in a report on the Lumbee. And that goes, quote, apparently the Indian Office, which was a thing in the government at the time, had no knowledge of the existence of the Croatan Indians until the latter part of 1888. About that time, 54 of these Indians, describing themselves as a part of the Croatan Indians living in Robeson County and claiming to be a remnant of White's lost colony, petitioned Congress for such aid as you may see fit to extend to us. This petition was referred to the Indian Office, and on January 7th, 1889, a copy was sent to the director of the Bureau of Ethnology with the statement that there was no record in the Indian Office showing any such Indians or any such colony as that referred to, and requesting to be furnished with such information as said Bureau had concerning these people. So to be clear, the Indian Affairs Office, which is now the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was and is a part of the federal government within the Department of the Interior. Mostly the Department of the Interior manages public land, but if you've ever been to a federal park or national monument, you were almost certainly in a place maintained by the Department of the Interior. They also do things like the U.S. Geological Survey, stuff like that. So they're the folks who wrote that book about the Brown Mountain Lights. that we talked about like 3 years ago?
Yeah, it's been a minute.
The Bureau of Ethnology was and is a division of the Smithsonian Institute, which was created by Congress in order to transfer anthropological study of Native Americans as distinct from administration of federal relations with tribes from the Department of the Interior to the Smithsonian. And the name has changed over time, but the Bureau of Ethnology still exists as a division of the National Museum of Natural History. So if you go to the Museum of Natural History on the Mall in Washington, D.C., there you are.
That's awesome.
The Bureau of Ethnology were, for instance, instrumental in recognizing that earthen mounds, such as the ones built by the Mississippian culture, were in fact constructed by indigenous people and not by some other unknown white culture that had visited North America in the past, which was the competing theory in the 19th century. And the reason this came up in the 1880s is that the people who now call themselves Lumbee had previously only been known as the Indians of Robeson County. The state had tried to segregate them, but the Lumbee refused to be segregated, saying they were neither white nor black and would not be forced to live as one or the other. In response, and in part because of the successful resistance by the Lowry Band a decade before, the state passed legislation identifying these people as the Croatan people, based on the Lumbee's own oral history and the narratives of many of their families of having come from a combination of the Roanoke colony led by white and the Croatan people, including setting up schools and a teacher college specifically for the people we now know as the Lumbee. And over time and through expansion and development, that teaching college became what today is UNC Pembroke. Yeah. To indicate how much the lost colony mystery, quote unquote, is one constructed in our times, in 1889, the director of the Bureau of Ethnology had to write to the director of Indian Affairs to explain and give them a 3-sentence summary of the history and mystery of the Roanoke colony and the Croatan people, and concluded by saying they assumed at least some Roanoke colonists had been incorporated in the Croatan tribe, and later this community had been called the Hatteras people. And this had all come up because this 1888 petition to the federal government was for federal funding for schools in Robeson County and federal support for the education of Lumbee children. And the response from the Department of the Interior read, "It appears that this band is recognized by the state of North Carolina, has been admitted to citizenship, and the state has undertaken the work of their education. While I regret exceedingly that the provisions made by the state of North Carolina seem to be entirely inadequate, I find it quite impracticable to render any assistance at this time. The government is responsible for the education of something like 36,000 Indian children and has provisions for less than half this number. So long as the immediate wards of the government are so insufficiently provided for, I do not see how I can consistently render any assistance to the Croatans or any other civilized tribes." So the Lumbee had gotten a raw deal for a long time. The federal government's response in 1889 was literally to say, "We're already really lousy at living up to our commitments, so you can't possibly ask us to do more." In the 1890 U.S. Census, the Lumbee are described by saying they were enumerated by the regular census enumerator in part as whites, that they are clannish and hold with considerable pride to the tradition that they are the descendants of the Croatans of the Raleigh period of North Carolina and Virginia. On March 11, 1913, the North Carolina legislature declared the Lumbee to be, quote, the Cherokee Indians of Robeson County, which prompted the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to start looking into Lumbee identity to determine whether they should instead be federally recognized as a distinct people, or if all the obligations they had to the Cherokee now applied to the Indians of Robeson County. And from what I can tell, the reason for this declaration is pretty complex, and it has at least a little to do with what a white state senator who had decided he knew the real history of the Lumbee, and that it was that they were the Cherokee who had relocated, etc. But also it may have been an attempt to alleviate prejudice against the Lumbee because derivatives of Croatan had come to be used as racial slurs against Native Americans in the region, and they were trying to give them a different name they could use for themselves.
Huh.
In 1914 and 1915, letters between the Bureau of Indian Affairs, its agents, Secretary of the Interior, and the U.S. Senate described the results of the Bureau of Indian Affairs' own research and investigation into the history of the Lumbee people. And in 1914, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution instructing the U.S. Department of the Interior to figure this out. And the rest of the document where this history came from is mostly letters back and forth between the U.S. Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Ethnology, and the U.S. Senate as they try to figure out whether it's okay for North Carolina to have called them Cherokee. This includes the whole question of the lost colony having to be explained again less than 30 years later, because still nobody remembered it. Part of the explanation is a review of a history and report written by John Lawson describing his explorations of the North and South Carolina coastal regions in 1700 and 1701. Lawson was the surveyor general for the Carolina colony and was charged with exploring the coast. His report includes a bunch of stuff I mentioned in our Lost Colony episodes, like the Hatteras Indians telling him they were descendants of the merger of the Roanoke colony with the Croatan people, that they knew what books were, their term for reading and writing was, quote, making paper speak, that English names were in use among Hatteras people and the peoples around them. He has a 60 to 70-year-old guide in his explorations in 1700 named Will, specifically named Eno Will, which I, in my uninformed way, read to be basically like if we were talking about someone I know named Lowry, and I wanted to distinguish her from other Lowrys by calling her California Lowry, or if I wanted to distinguish my friend Alex by saying Massachusetts Alex, things like that. He reported that they commonly saw a ghost ship and identified it as Sir Walter Raleigh's ship by name. The Bureau of Indian Affairs notes that all but 2 of the histories they can find of the Croatan people reference Lawson's report as definitive and true. And the Bureau of Ethnology also noted indications of English culture, practices, technology, and inherited traits in their complexion, hair, eye pigmentation, home construction, clothing, farming practices, and language. They said at the time in their own publications that the Lumbee were still, at the turn of the 20th century, using words from, quote, quaint old Anglo-Saxon, giving 75 examples of specific words long since modified or abandoned by modern English that demonstrated a direct and very old connection to the language and grammar of colonial era England. It's also worth noting, and this is something that Modern Mombi brought up, and I had read about at the time we were working on those Lost Colony episodes, that there are names of members of the Roanoke colony whose names were still commonly in use among the Lumbee in the time of Henry Berry Lowry, including Henry Berry, which was the name of one of the Lost Colony colonists. And many of those names are still common among the Lumbee today. But in 1953, the Lumbee people chose the name Lumbee to reflect the river and the region where they've made their homes and communities for so long. And the state recognized that name change. And all of that came about because a guy in 1864 accused his neighbor of stealing 2 pigs, and it spun out of control. And that's the story of the Robin Hood of the Swamp.
Sometimes things get carried away.
They do. That's the longest episode we've ever done. I'm very sorry.
No, don't apologize. That was a lot of work. And I do think it should stay as one giant episode. I think it doesn't. I don't think that works as a 2-parter. I think you need it all to be contiguous because otherwise you'll forget stuff.
That's another reason why we haven't released as many episodes this summer, because I have been spending a lot of time reading about Henry Berry Lowry. But it's really fascinating. And his cabin is actually on the campus of UNC Pembroke now as a memorial to him. There's a lot of information about him out there. The Lumbee tribe has information about him on their website. UNC Pembroke has information about him. He is a huge figure in the culture of the Lumbee people, and rightly so.
It's awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you for your patience, and thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. For more episodes, behind-the-scenes information, and links to our social media, check out www.arcanecarolinas.com, where you can also buy the Arcane Carolinas book.
And if you like award-winning horror and science fiction, check out my books at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com or visit my publisher, Falstaff Books, at falstaffbooks.com. And if you have story suggestions, comments, or questions, email us at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. And thanks for listening.
Please use this big pause in the audio to remind yourself to delete the thing that Charlie said.